Obviously, a very, very strong panel. Again, we're delighted to have you with us today. We'd actually like to start with a bit of an experiment. So we'd like to start the discussion with a quick poll of the audience, actually, on a high-level question. So can I ask Katja, my colleague, to push the button there to post that poll question, which hopefully each audience member should see now. So it's popping up the window. So I'm just going to read it out. COVID-19 will permanently and significantly change the way the pharmaceutical industry runs trials once the pandemic recedes. And by that we mean clinical trials, by the way. So COVID-19 will permanently and significantly change the way the pharmaceutical industry runs trials once the pandemic recedes. And if you just click on one answer and submit your question, I've just done that now. And then hopefully we will get the results now. Okay, so I can't see anything. Katja, now we got the results. So I don't know if people can see that, so we've got a 54% agree, which is good. We've got a couple of not sure, so we probably caused a bit of confusion here. I mean, I think, and there's a couple of strongly agrees and a few disagree. So I think the trend obviously is that people agree. And I would personally also agree. I think that's probably right, but actually I'm not the expert. So let me put that question actually to the panel to kick the discussion off. So do you think that the way the pharmaceutical industry runs clinical trials is permanently going to change after the pandemic has gone away? And let's this time start with Steve Powell. Steve, do you want to give us your views on that?
I guess the quick answer is yes, I agree. And the reason for that is that you have to mirror two things. One is, I don't think any of us have ever experienced anything quite like this in any of our careers. And therefore, whether we talk about new norms or whatever, there is something here that says in an industry which is not necessarily a part of the problem, but is part of the solution, the whole world is looking on the pharma industry and its allied organizations to actually deliver treatments, vaccines, or whatever. To do that when it quite clearly has been very difficult for them to run their normal processes during this time period, and at the same time be part of the solution, has to change the mindset. What tempers that a little bit is the fact that most people will agree that it's not a revolutionary industry. It tends to evolve. It's full of very smart people, most of whom tend to be cynical, and therefore doubt whether they really do need to change. But I think this is something that pushes them over the edge. So that's my answer.
Okay, great. So a bit of a catalyst really for change, of course. Can I ask Steve Kent to sort of comment on that question, if you've got any views? I think Steve looks frozen to me. So Neil, why don't you?
Obviously, I broadly agree with Steve. I mean, having worked in pharma for many, many years, we know it is desperately conservative, and change, even things that one thinks are obvious changes to happen, do not tend to happen quickly. Though clearly in the last 5-10 years, the rate of change and rate of technology adoption has actually increased. But I think it's interesting. There's different behaviours, different silos of activity that might change. For instance, the whole process of interacting with customers over managing clinical trials. I mean, hopefully we'll get rid of lots of the unnecessary meetings and international travel, and now people, Zoom, etc., have been demystified, and oh my God, it actually works. You can run a successful meeting without flying everybody from all corners of the world to sit in an office for 2 hours. So yeah, I guess I hope that kind of business process lesson is learned. And then clearly you would hope that people start looking to build smarter trials in which unnecessary hospital visits are eliminated, technology is used to take that strain, patient travel is limited or sorted out in a more orderly fashion. there's just a more sensible approach to doing it, instead of trying to do, doing everything in a protocol you possibly could, and all those things. Just thinking about it a bit more smartly. And interestingly, when I've been thinking about this, there's another knock-on from that, is the environmental impact, the sort of carbon neutral trial.
Yeah.
I don't hear many people do, but actually, if you can eliminate half the visits, half the travel, that's a reasonably significant change, I would have thought. So yes, I think some good things may come out of it, actually.
Very interesting. So you mentioned, and I think Steve is with us again. Steve.
Sorry about that.
Is that the builders going to broadband?
Power failure here. Sorry, my apologies.
Power failure. Oh, wow, okay. That hopefully isn't the workers, the builders.
Yeah, it was the workers. Yeah,
it was. Yeah. Expecting that. Great. So we've just had Neil give his view on that question. Steve, do you want to just give us your view as well on that question, whether the way the pharmaceutical industry runs clinical trials is going to change after the crisis?
I think it's likely to. I think it's very difficult to actually tell, but I think there's been a whole series of technologies that have been available to be used. Understandably, we work in an industry that is conservative in its decision making, and that means that people are typically slower to adopt technology than some other industries. I think that's the right way to be, actually. I think so. I'm not complaining at that. I think that's the logical thing to happen. But we've now got a situation where we've just conducted the biggest home working experiment ever, and that's actually forced the hand of our customers, and indeed the suppliers to our customers have had to come up with adapted ways of handling the situation that we all find ourselves in. So there's been some very strong learning experiences from that exercise. That's still going on, and yeah, I think there's an opportunity out of this for us to be in a better place in the conduct of clinical trials. I think we have, we obviously wouldn't like it to have happened this way, but actually as a result of it, I think it's quite likely that we'll be more agile and faster at processing and capturing data from people, and actually have access to patient populations that we might not have had access to in the past. So I think generally this is, in a year and a half's time maybe, we'll be in a better place actually as an industry to speed up the production of new medicines.
Okay, that's great. So if I sort of summarize what I'm hearing, so clearly, panelists think that the way trials are conducted, is going to change. And what I'm sort of hearing is that actually technology will have a big role to play in that.
Yeah.
Okay, so can we maybe sort of focus the decision just on the technology's software aspect? And what I'd quite like to understand, obviously, given your involvement, with a lot of software vendors, servicing the pharmaceutical industry, the clinical trials, and the real-world evidence side of things, what actually have you seen has been the short-term impact? So the impact to date of the COVID crisis, on the I guess on the software vendors into the pharmaceutical industry. And I imagine this will depend on which part of the pharmaceutical value chain you look at, probably which country, but just be really, really good, I think, for the audience to get a bit of a feel, what actually have software vendors in this sector seen to date. And so I'm seeing Neil is coming forward. So do you want to start with that then, Neil?
Well, I just think that the Greenfire experience is probably as close to real-time experiences kind of you can get. So we are transacting payments to patients and to investigators, but the patient piece is crucial here. Reimbursing them for visits, sorting out their travel to sites, etc., etc. And we've probably seen a halving of patient activity, and that was kind of an April stat. So it's probably, I suspect, worse than that now. It's less than half now. So there's been a real slowdown in patient activity. Most trials have effectively continued. Trials that haven't started have been delayed, and so but are still scheduled to go ahead, but later in the year. So I guess it's no surprise to anybody there has been a short-term, suspension of some activity. Some trials, say oncology trials, but people just have to continue. There's critical trials that people have to continue, so they continue. And as a consequence, the downstream consequence of this, I think is going to be quite interesting, because what we're now somewhat fearful of is, come October, we're going to have 3 times the number of studies wanting to start, because there is a bottleneck, and the work is still there. The work is absolutely still there, and actually, from the projects that for our sales pipeline and conversion of the pipeline into order book, we're still doing that. So the deal flow continues, but it's just not starting. It's delayed. So, yeah, assuming some return to something like normal around the world, September, October time, yeah, I think the back end of the year could be really quite challenging for us all to deliver. So yeah, that's kind of what we're seeing in real time, but the real barometer of what's actually happening in the clinical trial world.
Okay, very, very interesting.
Yeah, and I agree with that entirely. So one of the businesses I chair is Flex, and that's similar to Neil. It's almost real time. We're basically processing clinical trial data that's coming in and is being put into regulatory folders that are then used for submission of the for the marketing license application. And you can actually see the data arriving at different speeds around the world as the pandemic travels across the globe. It's quite chilling, actually. So China now, and actually for the past 2 months, has been pretty much back to exactly where it was before this started. And other parts of the world, that's not the case at all. And South America right now is clearly where a lot of issues are being concerned, and actually also still America. I do think we're the same. We see actually across a number of the business I'm involved in, we've actually continued to win quite a lot of business. So the order book is quite full, but people are not necessarily starting, converting that order book into revenue is definitely slower than it would have been. And people are delaying things because they're not sure when their studies are going to start, or there may be other reasons that are linked to COVID that is rather than just study startups that are causing the delay. But I agree with Neil. I think there's sort of a tsunami of work that's going to be coming at the back end of this year. Would be our best guess at the moment. It may spill into next year, but our concern at the moment is operational scaling. How are we going to cope with what we think is going to be quite a large increase in operational delivery?
Yeah, I mean, Christoph, let me build on that, because Neil and Steve have hit the nail on the head. Early on, everyone was reviewing their portfolio, looking at the studies, looking what was going on. Could they get patients into sites? Could they get information? Lots of delays, lots of postponements. And then you had 2 other factors that I think came in. One was that there was a flurry, and we saw this in probably 3 of the companies I'm involved in, a flurry of major pharma companies going back and saying, surely we'd looked at different technologies in the past that could have helped us. Let's go and unearth those discussions again. So there was a lot of, if you like, tailspin running around trying, could we do this? Could we do that? And then I think what I've seen is an awful lot of COVID projects springing up. Now, everyone and their uncle, if they've got any kind of antiviral, it's like, let's put it through some kind of trial to see if it's any use. You've got all the vaccine studies going on that are coming through in early stage. Some are now moving through later. So, I mean, Steve's point is a bolus of work that was originally there is going to be pushed out to the back end of this year. But you're also going to add on to that all of the COVID activity that's going on, which is huge. And so there's going to be, in some respects, an operational reflection from a lot of the software vendors of, how do we cope with the bolus and how do we cope with this additional work, which is in some respects good because it means there's more demand. But you've had that early hiatus, but the medium term looks pretty strong.
Okay, very, very interesting. So that, especially, I guess, that's your point, Steve Powell, that actually COVID has created additional sort of work, which, I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, I think from what we're seeing, I mean, the amount of money that gets funded into COVID now into research is just enormous. But I guess just focusing specifically on the software vendors, and I guess the impact that they've seen. So, I mean, I guess what I'm hearing is sort of, short term, there was initially a bit of an hiatus. Now it's sort of, getting back to sort of normal. And people are, Steve Powell, you said that people, are looking now desperately for technology. I mean, is this looking a bit into the future? I mean, the sales cycles, of software vendors into pharma are quite long. Are you seeing sort of now real adoption or a change in the way, I guess, the pharmaceutical industry is adopting, technology for clinical trials, for real-world evidence? Is that something that you are seeing? And maybe, I guess let's start that question, Steve, Kent, with you.
I would say the sales cycle's shortened. So after an initial period of hiatus where everybody worked out how they were going to work from home and sorted out their sort of domestic admin and the companies, both Neil and Steve said the companies reevaluated what they were doing, and that definitely was the customers reevaluating what they were doing, and that definitely slowed lots of things down. A lot of activity just stopped. Now we're seeing a complete reverse of that. So having stopped some activity, slowed stuff down. Now actually it's activity is accelerating, and the Zoom, Teams, Blue Jeans model, whatever you want to call it, the video conferencing model, has actually helped sell into the pharma companies. Where our sales teams are much more effective. You can demonstrate software incredibly well over video conferencing. You can engage actually with the right people much more effectively. Sales teams don't have traveling time, etc., etc. And then also, one thing I would say is that when you then get the customers engaged with you on a webinar, they are much more engaged, and we're able to get to a higher level inside the organization, much higher than we would have been able to before, because they're interested in how you can actually improve the process that they're going through. And so, I mentioned earlier that the conversion into backlog has improved significantly, even if that doesn't necessarily translate directly into revenue as fast as it would have done maybe in a pre-COVID world. But I think it's helped enormously, and I think it will continue to help. I think there's a big willingness inside the pharma company to work out how to use this crisis to best advantage. Never let a good crisis go to waste, and they're definitely following that mantra, as we all are, or trying to anyway.
Yeah, great. Okay, Neil, any sort of views from you? I mean, are you seeing sales cycles shortened, for your companies?
I don't think I could absolutely hand on heart say sales cycles have shortened, but what I would echo is we've definitely seen accessibility to higher level people is much better, and whether that and I would surmise that's because people aren't traveling, they're not having as many unnecessary meetings, they're actually getting on, engaging with actually not wishing to be patronizing, but doing some real work and actually moving the agenda of their businesses truly forward. And so people are filling their time usefully, and we're certainly getting business activity at a higher level than we would have normally easily got. So I think that's really quite interesting. And and volumes of inquiries, and Christoph, our Raremark example would be a good one, is massively up. I mean, you know, the delayed decision making, but the number of very interesting discussions we're having is massively up compared to 2 quarters ago. So yeah, so I'm sort of mirroring the same thing, that I haven't seen it convert into hard, you know, endpoints in terms of the sales.
Okay, great. And the other Steve Powell, do you want to comment on that quickly? Sales cycles?
Yeah, I mean, I think 2 things you have to take in mind is that the pharma industry has been talking about initiatives such as patient centricity and digitization for a number of months, if not years. And someone high up in every single pharma company is going to turn around and go, and what are we doing? And how are we not improving upon our current processes and our ability to do this, that, and the other? And I think that's what's happened, is a lot of people have then gone running and said, oh my God, we've got to look at something. And that's what, you know, both Steve and Neil are saying, is there's a great deal more interest in the software that exists today, not about something that's there tomorrow, but what exists today and how can we do that. Let's not forget that for a very, if you like, intelligent industry, it's still driven by an awful lot of manual processing. And you combine that with the fact that in the current environment and for the foreseeable future, the ability to entice patients or subjects into an investigator site, whether it be a surgery or a hospital, is going to be very difficult. So they are going to have to think through things in a very different way. And I think that has created a great deal more interest.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, I think that touches on, I guess, a point that that both Neil and sort of Steve Kent made earlier, around using technology to sort of, I guess, virtualize, you know, part of the, you know, the sort of clinical trials. And let's maybe sort of just pause on that sort of virtual clinical trials for a moment, because I mean, I think that's been something that the pharmaceutical industry has been talking about for some time. But I think actually, you know, in practice, we haven't really seen much of it yet. Is that something that you think will now become reality in, you know, in the sort of near term, let's say in the next sort of 1 to 2 to 3 years? And I see sort of Neil shifting again, so let's.
Yeah, virtualization has been talked about for a long time, and clearly there is an appeal to that, but we've got to be realistic. Yeah, some therapeutic areas, some diseases do not lend themselves to be managed at home. So you'll never be able to virtualize all trials. So certain aspects of certain trials you may be able to virtualize, but some things are always going to have to be, you know, you need a CT scan, if you need you know, any kind of interventional investigation, any of the hard endpoints that in a lot of diseases that you need, that's always going to be hospital based. So I think what we've got to look for is a sort of a hybrid model of a clinical trial, where you try and virtualize, you look at the whole process and virtualize the bits you can, but accept that some of it is still going to be hospital based. And I think, there's this idea that a whole trial can be suddenly virtualized. I think is not what we should be aiming for, because I think it is largely unrealistic. And we have to remember that part of the art of medicine is that interaction with the doctor and the patient, and that's a very important part of the clinical journey. And we can't get rid of that, and it would be a shame to do so. So I think we'd have to look at a hybrid model for trials, where we virtualize what we've done. We're smart about it. We eliminate the unnecessary things and focus on the really necessary things that have to be hospital based, and go for a hybrid model. Because if you say to someone, right, I want to virtualize this whole trial, the experiments that have been done make it seem it is A, very difficult, and B, it's just not. I just don't think it's realistic to do so. So let's be smart about it. Let's virtualize the bits we can. Let's but let's accept that we can't do it all, but we can make it a lot better than it is now.
Very interesting, thanks, Neil. And Steve Kent, I think, you know, when we last spoke about this, you had some really interesting comments around actually the sort of practical cost implications. I mean, do you want to sort of, you know, say a few words on this topic?
Yeah. So Neil's right. And, first did a talk on virtual studies in 2010. And the business I was in at that time had just run its first virtual trial for Pfizer. It's a huge success. We recruited 3 patients.
We were involved in that as well.
Yeah. So yes, we were. Exco were involved in that as well. Yeah. So so I think this is probably a 20-year journey from where we are now, picking a number out of the air. I do think wearable devices are going to have a profound impact on gathering data. That's already happening in some therapy areas where actually they are, the data that's being gathered by those devices is becoming actually a very important part of the dossier for submission. Yeah, and both Neil and I were heavily involved in ECOA businesses. And you can see in some therapy areas, actually, the ECOA data was actually the primary endpoint data. So all of that is, in some therapy areas, I think it makes a huge amount of sense. And those areas of investigation will adopt this technology more quickly because actually it's not only better, it's cheaper. I think also virtual studies will become more routine in some rare diseases where the patients are very hard to find, and where you have geographic constraints and other things, that make it difficult to gather a sufficient population to run a proper study. But everything else, I agree with Neil. You've got to be practical about these things. It's going to be a long, long time before you have very significant, where the majority of studies are going to be entirely virtual. That may never ever happen actually, but if it does happen, it will be some distance in the future, and the technology has to improve further. And more importantly, the organisations that are supplying some of this technology need to mature as organisations. They need to be bigger businesses. Their operational delivery needs to be more robust, so that they can be relied upon by their customers.
Okay, very, very interesting. And yeah, Steve Powell,
yeah,
go ahead.
Just on 2 points, and I was really going to come on to the point that Steve last made, because I think that's an important one, which is what the implications for the software industry. But Neil used the right word. It shouldn't be virtual trials, it should be smart trial. It's how do you do a trial in the most effective and efficient way? Some of that will be virtual, some of it won't be. Depends on what you can do. The issue I think here is more around the fact that the technology has to be fit for purpose. Some of this is down to the software industry itself. Some of it's down to the pharma company that buys from it, who's tended to look for what I call outreach data capture. Oh, well, we want to do this. Can you do it some form of electronic version of it? Rather than saying, who are we trying to capture information from? How are they going to use that technology? How is it, fit for purpose, easy to use, something that's ubiquitous? That has to happen to get more digitization through this. And that means that I think the software industry has to grow up a little bit, and it has to really focus on technology that is fit in that environment. So for instance, if you're talking about patients, it's got to be built for the ground up for patient use, not something that we build that we'll give to a patient to use. A lot of the early clinical systems, EDC, frankly, it was outreach data capture of, well, we'll give this to a doctor to use. Not surprisingly, the doctor rallied against it, and they were being paid large amounts of money. And you can't be in an environment where you're going to have to pay people large amounts of money to use technology. So that, I think, has to change.
Yeah, very interesting, very interesting. I'd like to turn to a slightly sort of different topic around the regulators in all this, because I think, I can't remember who said it at the beginning, this is a slow-moving industry, and one of the reasons, of course, the industry is slow-moving is it's heavily regulated. And clearly, any sort of changes in clinical trial protocols and how we, how the pharmaceutical industry delivers clinical trials, has to sort of be sanctioned by the regulators. And so I guess my question, to the panel is, do you see regulators actually, starting to shift, relax and ease rules now in the short term, and then how do you think this is going to pan out in the long term? And let's start the question actually with Steve Powell.
There's a logical answer, and then you're dealing with regulators. So the logical answer is that for people that come and look at this industry and say, how is a drug approved? And what they find is that there's probably about 15 Pantechnicon vehicles full of paper that goes to a regulatory authority for them to review. And at the same time, they ask and they say, and how many people has this been tested on? And someone says, 7,000. You look at it and go, the real world evidence side of what it's really like to use this in vast populations around the world is becoming more interesting. And regulators are pushing for more information. They're also pushing for more information from patients directly. So logically, you would say that you would start to streamline such that rather than it being a be-all and end-all about getting a registration through, that actually it's an ongoing process. And both regulators and I think the industry have to change as to what that means in terms of safety signaling, et cetera, as you run through, and how you run real-world evidence studies. If you do that, I think we could get drugs to market sooner. And I think there would be more tailoring in terms of getting those through to people that really needed it. You kind of think that regulators are looking to change the speed at change. I'd like to think it was quick, but I never believe that regulators change that quickly. And sometimes it's an excuse that the industry falls behind. Oh, well, we're driven by what we have to do from regulators. So the logical answer is, yeah, it should change dramatically. Will it? I'm not so sure.
Okay, very, very interesting. Neil, do you want to comment on this, and maybe so specifically also adoption of actually technology around the sort of clinical trial and real world evidence? Is there anything that you're seeing at the moment?
Broadly, I agree with Steve on what he said. One thing that does resonate that he said there is that I do think at times we and our customers use regulators as an excuse not for getting on with stuff. And I think broadly my experience is that if a solution is well put together and appropriately validated and is in the right context of what it's trying to solve, the problem it's trying to solve, the regulators will take a sensible view of that. And and they're not anti-change or trying to take a Luddite view of the world. I don't think that is true, and I do think people use regulators as an excuse for not getting on with things. So yeah, look, I think there's plenty of opportunities for better use of technology, but developing technology is the commodity here. Getting somebody to program something, an app to collect some data, to interact with a Bluetooth device, we can do it, but how do you build it into a regulated process that is fit for purpose, and how to deliver that as a service into the industry? That's the key. So people who do that well will be able to make good changes and good progress, I think.
Okay, great. Steve Kent, a few thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, I think there's a few threads here. The regulators are sort of ambivalent around technology. I wouldn't say they're necessarily overtly pro, but they're certainly not against. And the guidance they'll give is actually always pretty vague, which is not particularly helpful. And their concern is to make sure that they don't favour one technology or one business over another. So they're trying to be even-handed, which in turn means that they tend not to be terribly helpful. I think they've done absolutely everything they can through COVID to try and expedite things COVID-related. And so people are looking to that as a model of how they should behave in the future. I think they will probably try and follow that going forward. But ultimately, they answer to politicians. And as soon as we have a Vioxx or another major issue, then politicians will weigh in, and we'll end up with with some things that happened post Vioxx, right? With a whole bunch of additional regulation that came in. I don't see this industry ever becoming a lightly regulated industry. It's just not going to happen. Good job too, frankly. I think we'll always be in a highly regulated. I think the regulation will continue to grow despite what politicians say. There's more regulation now post-Trump than there was pre-Trump, despite all the things he's said. And I think that's not going to change. I think there'll always be reasons to put more compliance information in to make sure that people are doing things in the right way.
Yeah, very, very interesting. I just want to pick up one point that Steve Powell made just earlier, as a sort of last question, I guess, before we go into the Q&A session, which is around sort of the move towards real-world evidence, which is obviously a trend that we've sort of seen before the crisis. And I guess my question to the panel would be, do you think that actually this crisis is accelerating, this trend to real-world evidence? Given that people are now adopting, more technology, they are moving to maybe not necessarily virtual trials, but sort of smarter trials. Regulators are perhaps relaxing somewhat. Is there going to be an acceleration towards sort of real-world evidence and less sort of interventional trials? I don't know who wants to take that question. Maybe we'll go with the other way around. So, Steve, Kent, do you want to sort of start with?
Sure. So. Definitely the trend has been to gather more real-world evidence, but that's been in addition to gathering interventional information. And indeed, a number of compounds, or new chemical entities in particular, have had heightened requirements for ongoing gathering of data post license approval. And I think that's likely to continue in the same vein we were talking about regulation and compliance earlier. I do not see it replacing interventional at all, probably ever, because there's too many variables in real world evidence so that for you to actually understand the impact on patient populations. As we move further into personalized medicine, I think that means that actually interventional analysis becomes even more important. So I don't see it replacing. I see it being in addition. It's an additional cost and possibly an additional extension of time as a sort of counter to some of the things we've been talking about.
Okay, and Neil, your views on this?
Yeah, I think Steve got it right. I think real-world evidence is there in the armory of drug development and supporting that process, but it can't replace some of the hard endpoints that need to be gathered, and that I don't think that changes anytime soon. But yeah, clearly, post-marketing surveillance of drugs is going to become much more regulated. I think it's going to become a much more formalized process. So new chemical entities will have a requirement to monitor progress of the drug as usage is scaled up, and that would seem incredibly logical. And I think as technology enables that, regulators will be more keen to avail themselves of that.
Okay, and Steve Powell, I mean, obviously you're chairman of a real-world evidence data business. Keen to get your views on that topic.
I differ slightly from the two guides. I think mainly my view is there will be a blurring of the lines. Quite rightly, you need to run experiments, which is what interventional clinical trials are, to get endpoints. I think alongside that, what the industry has been, in my view, very bad at is an endpoint was getting an NDA in, an endpoint was then getting a registration, an endpoint was then, time to peak sales. And routinely, the problem is, as you bring out more powerful medicines, more expensive medicines, that pharma companies don't know enough about those medicines from the information they've gathered through a clinical trial program. And so it's in the regulators and the industry's best interests that you have a tightly controlled set of information that is being provided in the early years post-launch, which is really where real-world evidence, in my mind, comes in, rather than what it was a few years ago when it was late-phase research. Well, how does this compare with a competitor in the market space, et cetera, et cetera. So, to my mind, I think that you're doing two different things. One is you're conducting experiments to get endpoints. The other one is you are looking at real-world medicine being practiced and learning information from that. And I think that has to become more sophisticated in terms of getting that information, because it's critical to how products then go out around the world. So I think that the boundaries are narrow a little bit. One won't replace the other, but I think they have to work far more harmoniously than they do today.
Great, very interesting and very insightful. So I think we should probably stop this part of the webinar now and actually move to the Q&A session. So can I hand over to my colleague Andrew Elder? You're still on mute, Andrew, so you need to unmute.
I'm here.
Andrew, over to you for the Q&A session.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So we've had some really interesting questions on a lot of the topics we've already discussed, but just expanding on them. So just to give the panelists a bit of an idea of the topics that be good to post some questions to you on. So we've got a couple of questions on RWE, just to expand on that, which I'll come to in a second. Another one on tech and how it can help deal with the bottleneck and glut that we're, the parts of the process which tech might help automate. And then we've got some other questions just around the regulators and how they might drive protocols in the future. So I think if everyone could just be thinking about those areas, I'll just, first man to the buzzer, I think, if we can, whilst we're still on RWE, picking up where Steve left off, there's a question just around the earlier collection, a more systematic collection of RWE data. Do we think that's going to happen as people become less sensitive about data sharing and recognizing the importance of that? So really sort of just expanding on Steve's earlier point about the importance of RWE. Do you think we're going to be doing it earlier and more systematically?
Well, I think it's self-evident that probably is the case, though the adoption and expansion of RWE has been pretty painfully slow, really. And if this is a catalyst to actually engage properly with that process and understand the true value of RWE, because it's actually a hugely important part of the data set that we collect on patients' reactions to or interactions with new drugs, the better. So I would hope that it will concentrate people's minds and actually doing this much more systematically, and it's built into all clinical development programs.
Great. Unless there's any other sort of conflicting views, I'll move on just in the interest of time to a question about the bottleneck we touched on at the beginning, this big glut coming through. Where do we think technology can most impact that? Which stages of the whole trial process do we think that we can automate best using technology to most impact that?
Well, the technology can be applied to any of the stages of the clinical trial. It's the setting up of that technology appropriately for whatever the trial requirements are, and depending upon what we're talking about, that might be done by the customer, or it might have to be done by the vendor. So it's those sorts of things that there's a concern around. But just setting up a new instance of the software for a client. If you're operating a run rate of pick a number, but you're now multiplying that by twofold or threefold, then that's the issue. And it'll be short-lived. I mean, there'll be, it'll last for 3 to 6 months maybe before we then settle down to whatever the new norm is. But there's just a concern of, the usual good quality problem to have of how do you cope with the growth, and how do you cope with the growth where you're not certain that higher level of activity is going to be permanent.
I mean, my view on this is, I'd be interested in my fellow panelists' views on this, but if we had a marker where 100% was that every single trial currently being run or forecast to be run in the next year uses the optimal technology that is available today, where do we think we are? If 100 is 100% and 0 is 0? Because my guess is I wouldn't put us higher than about 30.
Definitely. It's definitely less than 50. I know a couple of the businesses I'm involved in, the biggest competitor is paper.
Absolutely.
It's not technology, or other technology companies, it's paper.
And Steve, just to expand on that, presumably that 30 or 50, whatever it is, that's mixed up with
that's a very
parts which are 0 and parts which sure, but it's a mixture of some which are at 0, some parts of the process are at 0 and some are at 100. Lots are sort of in between, and the average is about 30 or 50.
So I come back to the precept that effectively we're running still majority manual paper-based processes in a lot of areas. So if you were to then take technology that exists today, that has been proven in various cases, Steve makes a good point about scale up, which means, you're not going to go to 100% immediately, but that technology exists today. If you put it in there, you could move towards 100%. Now, if that's the case, then technology is a big part to play in this. And you've then got to look at the psychology of the industry, because the industry has its own organizations within each pharma practice, and then it outsources a lot to CROs. Now, my own view, having worked in this industry for a long period of time, is that you should look at a CRO as an outsourced organization and saying they should be the most efficient in delivering all of this stuff than anyone else, because they do it for many. In truth, many of them aren't. And many of them aren't, not necessarily because they're inept, although there is a certain level of ineptitude. Many of them aren't, is because each of their pharma clients come and say, but I need you to do it this way or that way. Where someone from another industry will walk in and say, why can't you just, all do this?
Yeah.
And they don't. And so part of this is the industry itself feeling that, it's the old adage of Pfizer used to believe that the color of its toilet paper was a competitive advantage. That you get these stupidities of saying we should be looking at streamlined processes. It should be form and content. What is it that we need to achieve? Where do we compete? And the rest of it is doing it in the most efficient manner. And the industry is a long way away from that. And that's why technology has a huge still part to play.
Just pick up a couple of threads on that.
Yes, Steve.
So the CROs, in particular, I would say the CROs actually still are a force of innovation within the industry. They will all complain, to your points, they'll all complain that they not only have to adopt the process and methodology of the customer, and that is unique to each customer, completely agree, but also the systems are completely unique to each customer as well. So if you're a CRO, you run half a dozen different EDC systems, depending on who your customer is. And one of those may be one that you would prefer to use because your staff are trained on it and so on. For example, I think the other point here, or the good point around this, is I think there's a level of maturation that takes place. So when you look at spots of high adoption of technology, such as EDC, what happens is that there becomes an accepted industry practice on how to use that technology most effectively. And yes, that evolves over time and changes, but people do follow sort of best accepted practice, and that can drive a consistency of application, which makes the process significantly more efficient. The problem is that right now, that adoption is completely patchy across different segments of the clinical trial process, and you end up with some pharma companies, Pfizer being one, Novartis being another, where not only do they have their own process, but they may decide that they want to go and build their own technology just for them, and because nobody else does it the way that we need them to do it, because they're special in some way, and that's obviously rubbish.
And can I just, I've got 2 or 3 questions that's like pulled together in a quick, we're just running out of time, but quick fire sort of question on this. If you were a pharma company and you had 1 or 2 points in the sort of development process that you could change from analog to digital and or apply technology to automate to have the biggest impact in the efficiency of the process, which would be the places you would change with a magic wand, today?
Well, I would go for something around patient centricity. So every study should have a proper eco and engagement program that actually manages the patient interface and allows smart managing of the patient.
Thanks, Neil. Steve?
I would echo that. I think it has to be the patient for 2 great reasons. One is, at the end of the day, without patients, we've got nothing. Beside the fact that healthcare professionals have got a key role to play, but you start with the patient, and you start with the fact that you capture as much information directly from the patient at source as you possibly can, that you're able to. And at the moment, we have an industry that collects the favourable information with eCOA and not the unfavourable information. So, when you look at safety profiles and things like that, there's no information that comes back from patients on safety. And that is a real weakness in the industry, because that's when it should come back. It shouldn't wait for someone to appear in front of Investigator maybe 3 or 4 weeks later to say, oh, this happened to me. So I think you've got to look at it and go, focus on the patient, put the technology that you need around the patient. A lot of things downstream will follow from that.
Yeah, so I think it's an integration point. I think we actually have lots of different systems, some of them paper-based, which gather data about patients, whether they're electronic patient records, hospital systems, or eCOA or other techniques. But the integration of all of that data set into something that is available appropriately, I think that's the secret sauce. If we could do that as a business, as a world, that would make a tremendous difference, not just the clinical trial process, but also to actually healthcare.
Thanks, Steve. That's really helpful. I mean, that actually addresses, I think, several of the questions we've got coming in. So that's great. We're running out of time. We do have one last, I think, quite an interesting, challenging question, very high level. So, but I think probably a yes, no, or very, very short answer from everyone. And that is, there's a big culture shift needed to do the kind of change in such a conservative industry. To what extent do you think the culture of the industry can be changed, and can we overcome the inherent conservatism within it?
Gradually. It'll never happen. It's always going to be evolution, not revolution.
Yeah, I agree with that. And actually, I think that's not too negative a thing.
Yeah.
Basically, we know so little about how the human body operates and works that actually trying to move too quickly could give us major problems.
I'd echo those thoughts, but to bring this back again, COVID-19 is a real wake-up call. The industry has had plans before for pandemics. It had some companies had a plan for H1N1 back in 2008 and never carried it through. now coming out the back of this has to be a view of how do we cope as an industry if something like this happens again, and what do we do? We can't be running around chasing our tails. So I think it will be still evolutionary. I would just hope that the evolution is a bit at a faster pace than previously.
Great, thanks, Steve. And I think that probably brings our Q&A to an end. Apologies to anyone if we haven't had time to cover your question. I think I've tried to cover as many sort of broad areas as we could, but Christoph, back to you.
Great. Okay. So great sort of note to end on, Steve Powell. And this brings the webinar to an end. So kind of first of all, thank all the panelists for your excellent contributions. Really, really interesting discussion. I learned a ton today. Thanks also to the audience for joining in. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something today. And please watch this space for future AlbionVC webinars. Goodbye.
Great. Thanks, Christoph.
Thank you. Thank you, Christoph. Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks,
Steve,
everyone.
Neil.
Great to see you.
See you guys.
Right.
Bye, everybody.